Okay, I think we have our volume figured out, so hopefully you can hear me okay. And what I'm going to do is show you how to create an application very quickly on NodeRun. You got a little bit of an explanation of what NodeRun is about. Now it's time to see a real live demo. So the neat thing is that to get started on any project is you just come to the Cloud IDE, the NodeRun.com website, just like I have here, and you just click New Space. So as soon as I click New Space, I get a full environment that's dedicated to me, and you can see that it only took about 1 second for me to build this environment. So I now have a web server, I have a database here, I have my own set of files. There are different ways to get started with NodeRun. I can select from one of these templates here if I wanted to get started with an example. I can clone an existing Git repository if I'm signed in with my GitHub account, or I can close out of this dialog and start completely from scratch, which is what I'm going to show you today, how to build an application from the ground up and build the database and everything. And also we'll connect it to an IBM server by the end of this demo. So the very first thing that you see here is this README file, and that's just an explanation of what the project is about. So what we're going to build is an IT service request type of application, so form to gather IT service requests. And let's just put some comment in here like this is a demo application. And I'll go ahead and click save. And at this time, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to click publish, which allows me to give my workspace a name. So we'll call this something like form demo. Now, if I was really diligent about it, I would also put in a description and keywords, and I would dictate what my public permissions are. But for this demo, I'll just leave everything as default and go ahead and click publish. Once I publish, it gives me these unique URLs that I can use to come back to the space so that I can work with it later on. But in the meanwhile, let me just close this and let's start building the application by selecting new and rich display file. So a rich display file is our technology to build user interfaces, and you can build user interfaces much quicker than hand coding things from scratch using markup. So you start out by dragging widgets here on from the left-hand side, and you can see we have different widget sets. You can build your own widget sets, but we also provide a number of widgets that we already ship. Everything really that you need to start building an application. So let's start out with a panel. So let's find this widget here. Let's do this one right here. So here we have a panel. We'll expand it to make it bigger on the screen, and we'll give it a title. So this will be our IT service request. And then let's design a form. So I'm going to come back and ask the user for some information. So let's ask for name. So this is just a label for name. And let's do a label for email, for example. And let's ask them what type of problem they're having. And we'll allow them to provide details. And I wasn't very careful, so these are not lined up, but let's just right click and align left. So now they're lined up a little better. So the name, we'll have them type that into a text box. So I'll just drag a text box onto the screen, maybe put it over here like this and expand it. Email, that will also be a text box. So I'll do the same thing here. Now type of problem, that can be perhaps a drop-down box. So they can choose from a list. And let's use a text area for details. Maybe I'll put it over here. Expand it like this. And finally, I'll add a button. So a button like this to the bottom so that they can submit the information. We'll type in submit request into this button. So you can see how quickly it takes me to build an interface, and everything is configurable here. So I can go over to the properties window. So this properties window allows me to dictate how each one of the widgets is going to function and how it's going to look. So if I wanted to make some changes, let's say the icon, maybe I want to put it on the right side, and maybe I want it to be maybe an arrow or something like that. Maybe this one. So you can see how quickly it is to make changes, visual changes to the widgets. And of course, I can do things like alignment. So I'm going to horizontally align these. The next step is for me to provide validation. So this is another thing that you can just provide by using configuration instead of typing in code or figuring out how to do this. So for example, if the name field is required, I can find the required property and set that to true. Or another example might be if I have an email address, I can set a property that says validate this to be a valid email. So validate email is a property. So you can see that I set up some validation right off. And as a final step, I'm going to give each one of these a name that is tied back to my backend code. So I'm going to double click each one of these and I'm going to do what's called binding, which is just really giving field names. Now, this type of screen can be backed by either an RPG program or a Node.js program. So in this example, we're going to use Node.js. But think of these as field names within your program, whatever the server-side language is. So we'll say name, that will be 25 character varying. Email, let's make that 50, a little longer. Type of problem, let's call that type, and also character varying 50. And details, that will be much longer, maybe something like 999. And finally, the submit button needs a response property. So we're going to bind that to Boolean indicator. We'll call that submit. Let's also give this screen a name. So I'm going to call this just form, very simply. And so now I'm done designing the screen, and I'm going to go ahead and save it. And I'm going to call this just form. Now you'll notice that this is saved in JSON format, and then it's going to be rendered as DHTML or dynamic HTML. So let's go ahead and click save. And let's test this out by selecting launch, and I'm going to say launch screen preview. So this is what it looks like when you run. Of course, there's no code, there's no logic yet, but there's already validation. So for example, if I click submit right now, it's prompting up validation over here. I can type in some data, for example, but still this is not a valid email address, so it will catch that for me. Now, if I type in something that does look like an email address, I can then submit. Of course, right now, this is just telling me that this is a previous screen that was submitted, and if we wanted some functionality, maybe collect this and put it into a database, we would need to write some code. So that would be the next step, and let me show you how you would go about writing some code. And it's a matter of selecting new JavaScript file. So in this particular case, we're building the code as a Node.js backend. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use our Profound.js API to interface with the screen that we built. And we're going to use the define display API, which is very similar to, if you're comparing it to an RPG program, very similar to an fspec that's connecting to a display file. So we'll call this display, that's the object name, and then we'll connect it to the form.json file that we just built. Next, we'll reference display, and we'll reference the form screen that we built, and we'll execute it. Very similar to an execute format type statement. So let's go ahead and just try this. I'm going to save. I'm going to call this just app.js. Click save. And before I can launch it, what I have to do is I have to tell my workspace what my starting file is for this application. And of course, it is this app.js file. So I'm going to right click the file, select properties, and then check app start file. Click OK. And now I can test this application with an actual backend. So I'm going to launch app in the browser. And if I typed everything correctly, this should launch the form. So it's really the same thing, but now this is truly powered by a backend already. This is running a Node.js server to run this. So that's how quickly you can get a Node.js server going. So let's see about actually putting in the logic to save this information to a database. So the very first thing that you have to do is you'd have to create a database. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to switch over to the database tab, and at this point we have no tables within our workspace, but I'm going to go ahead and create a table, and let's just call this table requests, and we'll add all of the same fields. So we'll add a name field, and that will be varying character, and just the same data type as we did before. That's length is 25. We'll add email, also varying character, The length is 50. We'll add type, varying character 25, and then we'll add details. And this will be varying character 999. So we're really matching that up to the data on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and run the statement here, and that created the database table for me. So it's that quick to create a database table. It's a visual interface for that. So now, as a next step, let's write the line of code to actually put the information into this database. And so after we execute the form and it passes validation, what we need to do is insert the data into the database, and the API for that is PJS Query. So PJS Query is a very versatile and simple API to either go out and query the database or really run any SQL statement, that would include a statement that would put information into the database. So it would look like this. You would just provide a statement. So insert into requests. We're using obviously SQL syntax, set, and then question mark. Of course, question mark, just like with your standard SQL, that's a placeholder for the data that's actually going in the database. And the data is then provided as an object. So using JSON syntax, we're going to say, let's put the name, email, type, and the details into the database. So that line of code writes the information to the database. And one other thing that I will do is let's add a message box. So we have an API that will call message box, and we'll just say, thank you. And maybe something like your request was added to our system. So let's go ahead and save. And notice, because we're using Node.js, there's no compiling or anything like that. The application is now live. So I can go ahead and refresh this application. And let's put in some information. Let's put in valid email address. Oh, you know what? I did skip a step. So before that, let me go back, because I never specified types of options. These are just default, option 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So before I proceed, let me go back to the screen and let's just put in some choices, and you'll see how simple that is. We have properties such as this choices property, and I can modify what choices belong in the drop-down box. So let's say maybe computer, hardware, or let's just say hardware problem, like this. Hardware problem, software issue, and maybe something like internet connection problem. So these will be the problem types that we have. Okay, let's go ahead and save this, go back, refresh, and I should see my list over here. So let's do this now. We'll do, let's say internet connection problem. We'll just say internet is slow today, and I'll click submit. And it looks like it ran and gave me the message. So let's go back and look at our data in the database. And you can do that right within here. I can say query my database, run this query statement, and you can see that my data now has the information within it. So we have a full application with just a few lines of code to collect some data on a form. So that's how quickly you can get that done. Now let's see about connecting this to an IBMI system. So what I have, I'm going to start a new tab, and I'm going to go to Genie. And as you recall, Andreas mentioned that Genie is our on-the-fly modernization tool. Really, it's a matter of just installing it, and you get pretty much a better 5250 interface that's browser-based that you can connect to your IBMI system. So I'm signing on with my IBMI profile, and I get my standard IBMI main menu. And here I've got some setup that I'm going to do. So I'm going to call this CL program that I have that sets up my library list. It sets up my library list. It adds a library that has a database table that I created in advance, and it's called requests. So I have a table called requests. Now, as you can imagine, it has the same fields as I built in my cloud environment. So let me look at requests just like this. Right now it has no data, but it has name, email, type, and details as fields. So let's now call the application that I build in the cloud, but we'll call it from IBMI and have it put the information onto the IBMI. We do that by running the NodeRun command that is installed as part of our ProfoundJS product. And if I prompt this, it will ask me for the owner of the space, and that's just my ID, which is just Alex. And then the workspace in this case is form demo. And I'll go ahead and click hit enter. So it called out to NodeRun from IBMI, and it's running that same application that I just built. So we can go ahead and put in some information. So let's just put Alex Reutemann. I'll actually put my full and real email address in here, for example. And we'll select, let's say, hardware problem. My mouse is not working. It'll be sample data. And I'll go ahead and click submit. And I got the message. I'll click OK on the message. And it comes back to my command line. And so now let me check the database table. And as you can see, the IBMI data is populated from the cloud application. So this is one way to get this project onto my IBMI. I can call it directly, but of course, IBMI can run Node.js. So one of the other things that I could do, I could come back to my IDE environment. And at any point in time, I can go to my file system and I can export this project, just download it as a zip. Is one way to do it. I'll show you another way, which is just using Git. But you can download this project and put it directly on IBMI within your ProfoundJS installation, and it can run directly on IBMI. It can run in a cloud environment. The very interesting thing about Node.js is that it's portable, and that has many, many advantages. So one of the interesting things that I can show you, since we have a little bit of time left, is that I can integrate all of this very easily with Git. On NodeRun, every space that you create is automatically a Git repository, and it has a visual Git interface. So it's showing me all of the files that I've been changing as I've been working on this. So I can do things like committing, and so let's do just a commit. So under actions, I'm going to say, let's commit all of the work that I've done so far. And I'm going to go ahead and click yes here, and you need a commit message. If you're familiar with Git, that's one of the things that you need whenever you do a commit. So let's just say first commit. This will be the message. And I'll go ahead and click commit. And so now this has been packaged as a commit. And as a next step, let me show you that we have built-in GitHub integration. So GitHub is a very popular hosting repository, for a host for Git repositories. And if I wanted to integrate with that, it's just a matter of clicking set up on GitHub. I am already connected here with my GitHub profile. If I wasn't, it would have asked me to sign in with GitHub. And then I would just specify what my repository name is. I can modify some of this information. Let's go ahead and click OK. So it took a few seconds here, and now that repository is on GitHub. And just to prove that this did work, I'm going to go to github.com, and this is the one that I just built, the form demo. So all the code that I wrote is now automatically on GitHub. Again, this is flexibility, so now I can connect to this from other IDEs. I can have multiple developers working on this as part of a process. So Git integration is pretty interesting and pretty important part of Node.js development. So before I wrap up, I want to show you another feature, and I'm going to jump back into the IDE. And one of the things you may have even asked yourself, is it a good idea to hard code the choices, or wouldn't it be good if the choices for the dropdown came from a database? And let me just show you how easy that would be to do. So I'm going to go ahead and create another table, and I'm going to call it types. And I'll just have one column in it, which I'll call type. And this will be a varying character column with 25 as a length. I'll go ahead and click run. So here's my types database table. And what you can do, and a lot of the widgets within the Visual Designer and the NodeRun IDE are capable of talking directly to a database. So I can go and find what we call database-driven selection options. And I can specify that I want my options to come from a table called types, and I want them to read it from a field here that I've defined called type. So just by setting these two options and not writing any additional code, this will now come from this database. Let's go ahead and populate some data into this database. So we'll add, again, maybe something like software problem, and maybe, well, let's go ahead with hardware issue again. Save that. And when I launch my application, so let's just refresh this browser. Now this data is coming not from a hard-coded list, but from a database. So you can see that implementing something like this took no coding, and this is the great thing about all of our technologies, that it really reduces the amount of steps and the amount of code that you have to write to get an application going. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions. We'll open it up back to Andreas as the presenter.